This is an RNZ podcast.
They say it takes a village to raise a child. I'm Kathryn Ryan, and here we draw on my conversations with experts on 9 to Noon to help you navigate family life. And with just over a month to go to the start of NCEA exams, there'll be more than a few nervous students around the country. It's been a tough year of learning interruptions for secondary students, particularly those in Auckland who suffered through 2 lockdowns. So with 5 weeks of studying time up their sleeves, what can students do to prepare themselves? Dave Cameron is Chief Executive of online learning tool LearnCoach and has some tips and tricks to make the exam period a bit easier. Dave, good morning.
Hi, Kathryn.
I mean, there's always the standard ways to help students prepare for exams, but what are the extra things you need to think about given the year they've had, Dave?
Well, I think the biggest thing to take away is that students are probably going to be feeling one of 2 ways at the moment. They're either going to be bored and pretty apathetic, not that motivated towards their exams, which a lot of students are still staying, especially coming off holidays. But we're seeing much higher proportions of students feeling overwhelmed and anxious at the moment, talking about stress and anxiety. And so the real tricks are going to be overcoming those and still getting good results.
So do you talk about these things directly up front as you begin to, discuss how you're going to confront this thing?
Well, I think the biggest thing you want to do to combat the stress and anxiety is just getting started, because stress is a feeling of being overwhelmed and not knowing what to do. And generally with all types of learning, progress equals motivation. So if you're doing really well, you're going to feel like keeping on going. Whereas if you haven't started or you're feeling like you don't know where to start, it's really hard to get started. So getting started is one of the biggest things.
For the unmotivated kid who's going, look, it's over. It's too late. I'm not there. I'm not going to be able to get there. How do you talk about starting from where they're at, but having a plan to get the best results they can get? How do you talk to someone who's in that mindset?
So talking to someone, the first thing is to normalise it, because we've found that more than 90% of students do the majority of their study in the month before exams. So there is still enough time. And then it's about getting tips and tricks. Things like picking resources that are specific to their exams, so students don't spend all sorts of time on YouTube learning irrelevant things that won't help them at all.
So where do you begin? At what stage should they be at right now in their strategising, first of all, their mapping out of what they've got to do the next month, and then getting on with it?
The best thing a parent can help a student do, or a student can do, is simply write down the exams they have coming up and roughly break them up to make sure they're covering them off week by week like a checklist, because you just want to make sure you cover everything before the exams. And then it just becomes about strategy of how best to complete your checklist. So things like finding resources like LearnCoach, which are specific to NCEA, say, and also doing past exam questions.
So are you the Coles Notes of my era?
Could be. We're very video based at the moment. I think a lot of people.
Same thing, Dave. It's like, I haven't been doing enough this year. So,
yeah.
Yeah, so here I am heading off to a bit of assistance. So let's just talk about this like seriously though. The first thing is to actually put those dates in the diary, and then you've got to think about how you still can't be ending up. You still need to pace yourself, right? So how are you thinking about pacing yourself, and then sorting the content, whatever the source is, sorting the content that you're going to use and sort in order to do this?
I think the number one thing you want to do after you've got your dates in your diary is just find a resource to actually help you. And if you're studying for, say, NCEA maths or biology, you want to find something specific that'll tell you exactly what you need to know for NCEA maths or NCEA biology. And then it's a matter of just sticking to it and working through those chapters if it's a workbook, the online modules if it's an online thing like LearnCoach, and continuing through it. And then you'll easily see, are you behind or are you ahead? Because if you haven't done it, you haven't done it. If you have, you're good.
For you, can you mix things up too? This is another thing. Like, you can get very, very buried and put a lot of time into one subject, say, or one component of one subject, probably a disproportionate amount of time. So how are you also coaching, talking to your student about pacing themselves to get the optimal result?
One thing we think is really important is spreading out the work. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first reason is that repetition is actually more powerful than doing everything well in one time. So for example, if you're wanting to learn something for biology about anatomy, Rather than doing one 3-hour session, you're much better in doing 3 different 1-hour sessions spread out over a few weeks. It also keeps your mind a lot fresher. And so it does the dual thing of helping you remember more, but it also means that if you run out of time, you've at least covered everything once, even if it's not as deeply as you wanted. So breaking things up into smaller modules and repeatedly going through it more quickly and more frequently is almost always better.
How much assistance do most students get with exam format, and what is the sorts of subjects that will almost certainly be covered? Is that fairly well provided to them by teachers?
It's incredibly variable. You get some teachers who are fantastic on teaching, say, mathematical skills, but don't spend much time breaking down what students will see in the exams. You get others who will put a lot of time into that, sometimes at the expense of mathematical skills. And so if you're a student or a parent helping somebody to learn, the number one thing you want to do is actually quickly go on to do practice exam questions, because the reality is they have to have very similar exams come up year after year. So if you want to know what's going to come up in this year's exam, going through the last, say, 3, 4, 5 years exams and actually seeing what questions they're going to ask, it's basically the same thing and some of the best preparation you'll do. So that's a huge part of what you can do as a student, but often it's not a big theme that comes through in schools.
So analysing the old exams will show you, say, a certain, if you prep, I don't know, for 6 topics or whatever, you're bound to have 4 of those topics you've prepped come up. It's really very strategic, isn't it?
That's exactly right, because there's probably 1,000 things in maths you could learn, and only 10 of them might come up in the exam. So figuring out what those 10 things are often comes out from doing practice exams.
The other matter of spreading, of course, is that the brain can only take so much. Boy, we cram it when we get into these situations, but it can only go so fast. It needs some time to absorb information. So again, like some students, I think if I do this now, I'll have forgotten it in 3 weeks. There are tips, aren't there, for doing that first initial deep learning and then having your little cues or reminders that will help you retrieve. How can you assist with that?
Well, the number one thing you want to do is spend enough time where you basically get the gist of something. So you won't be confident in all the details. You might not be able to answer all the questions, but you kind of understand it. And then it's a matter of just going through and revising it. We suggest about a week later, and then if you have time before the exam, about a month after that, and it sticks around. But if you're getting really close to exams, make sure you kind of understand it and then move straight to practice exam questions. So if you go to something like LearnCoach or how we set it up for our students, they'll do some learning, but then they'll quickly start doing exam questions. And even if students don't know how to do it, there'll be, say, videos explaining how to do it afterwards. So even the exam questions become a learning activity and a repetition of your learning.
So you're very big on doing the rehearsal exams, and even as you say, if you get in there and you don't know the answers, is that the point where you might pause and go back to a resource and learn about that particular topic?
That's exactly right.
So learning is happening in the context of doing an exam all the time.
Exactly. It's much like in a sport. If you're training for a game, you do a practice match, see what you did wrong and go and improve on those specific skills. It just really lines you up to be as successful as you can be and get your best results.
Does it get you over the intimidation of seeing the exam paper as well? Because you feel like you've done your work, you think you've got all your little cues in your head, and you're walking into that room and you think you can pull it out of the proverbial. But just looking at it can be intimidating. If you've practiced on old exams, does that sudden shock of, oh my God, this is it, ease up a bit?
You've completely hit the nail on the head. The number of times you see a student who's talented, they've learned everything, done everything right, then they pick up an exam paper, see a question that looks unfamiliar just because it's written in a difficult way and think, oh my goodness, I have no idea what to do. And it's horrible for a student. It throws them for their whole exam, and they actually don't end up getting the points that they deserve. So you couldn't be more right that seeing all this stuff come up in an exam format means you're going in fully prepared.
The other strategy is to understand that you can collect marks for imperfections. And could you speak about various subjects on this? That, okay, you may not be able to nail this particular question in the way it's being asked, but if you can show knowledge, you should be collecting marks. Is that still the case? And how can you educate around that?
That is completely the case. So if we look at, say, the most recent exam, which is the Algebra Level 1 exam, that's the only one that happens earlier than exam season, what we see is that you've got 3 big parts, which are all maybe have 5 subparts. So say 15 parts to a question, and only a handful of those are actually your basic questions. And if you want to pass, you can actually start every single one of those 15 questions. You only need to finish a couple of them to actually make sure that you can get a huge number of the marks. So starting a question, even if you can't finish it, will almost guarantee that you can pass, even if you still miss out on a number of those marks. So you're really increasing your odds of doing well if you just start every question you can.
What about other strategies, which is, it's funny, isn't it? If you go deeply, and this particularly happens in some of the subjects that have a lot of words attached, English and similar, right? If you go very deeply into one subject matter, it can be harder to retrieve some of the stuff that you've learned on other subjects. Is there a value in going in and key pointing, picking what your answers, picking which questions you're going to do, and key pointing down key facts before you go too deeply into a writing exercise?
That for a writing exercise for something like English or most of the arts subjects, it's hugely beneficial because you've got two parts to the exam. One is you figure out what you want to say in an essay, for example, and two is actually writing that down in a really clear format, like the actual essay itself. So spending the time at the start to plan what you're going to say allows your brain time to switch gears and just focus on the writing or communication part of it. So it's really important, less so in maths and the sciences.
Although some key equations that can be similar to, can't it? If you've gone in and you've been memorising like how some key equations or some key facts, is there a value in just jotting them down before you go deeply into a series of questions?
There can be. In the sciences particularly, there may be a few equations which aren't given to you in the exam, and in which case, absolutely, you should jot down those key definitions and equations right at the start. Fortunately, in NCEA, which most people will be sitting, most of the equations should be given to people. So actually practicing finding those on the sheet that they'll give you is the most valuable thing you can do.
Right. And again, in tackling most exams, do you, instead of rushing in on the first thing you recognise you can do you sit at first and work out how you're going to tackle that exam, look through the whole thing and work out some timing?
You can do that. I think just general timing is probably more important than picking the questions to start with. Usually exams are organised with simpler questions at the start and easing into it. And there's a lot of research to show that if you start with easy questions, you build up momentum and have more confidence and inertia to tackle the harder questions. And so as long as you, say, had 3 parts to an exam, you weren't taking 2/3 of your time on just the first question. So just check that you're roughly lining up. Then going start to finish is usually actually the best option because they write exams with that in mind.
To that point, for a student who no matter how much work they've done goes in there and the whole intimidation of the thing just causes them to freeze, what are some strategies for just calming down, deep breathing, reassuring yourself that it's all between those ears and you're going to bring it out? How do you deal with that kind of shutdown moment?
I think you're right. So there's a couple of stages you want to go through, and the first one is breathing. And actually what's interesting is people don't just stop breathing when they're consciously aware that they're freaking out. Many people, when they're thinking hard, stop breathing as well. And so being really conscious of making sure you're actually taking breaths when you're stressed out is critically important because you can't do much else. The second thing is that's where jotting down key notes or key points come in. And this could be if you're looking at a question and have no idea where to start, say a maths question, just write down the numbers that they've given you. And all of a sudden, when you're just looking at something that looks simpler, suddenly that can make the whole question and the whole task feel a lot simpler. But taking time out is critically important because it feels stressful, and if you get caught up in it, you stay frozen.
How do you deal with the issue of procrastination? It's almost impossible to avoid when you're undertaking any hard task. In fact, I think it's primal. It's your brain going, don't use up all this energy on me right now. Let's go do something else. Yeah. So, again, you could, rather than nagging as a parent, do you in some ways have to let a student work out their own way of getting into the zone, whether it's at a time of day you don't approve of? Like, how do you talk through that?
I think that the number one, it's a really difficult position because everyone procrastinates. It's the number one thing that students say that's their problems coming in. And again, there's 2 main reasons for it. One is just students feel bored or they don't like it because study is just hard work. And so the best thing you can do as a parent or even as a student setting it up is set out what you actually want to achieve before exams. And if the student can go to you as a parent and say, here's what I'm going to study for and here's what I'll cover this week, letting them do it their own way and just checking in to see did they do it or did they not, have you checked off those things on your list, is going to be the best way. Because you, as a parent, it really helps to hold people accountable. It's like if you don't want to go for a run and you have someone checking in, did you or didn't you, it probably might be enough to just push you out the door to give something a try.
That running analogy is a good one because there's days when you can go out and you feel like I'm flying, and there's days when you go out and it feels like every step is going to kill you.
Yeah.
Again, are there times to get up and walk away, or are there times just to push through, even if nothing's working? Pushing through is the way to opening the door to getting into a flow.
Yeah, well, I think you've identified getting into a flow is a really helpful state to be in. So if you find yourself banging your head against a brick wall and it's more than a couple of minutes where you're truly not making progress, it's worth walking away and coming back to it. or asking someone for help, like a teacher in class or a tutor, or looking at some resource online. Because it actually doesn't just mean you don't make progress on anything else if you're stuck. It also just knocks your confidence and makes the whole process really frustrating.
Actually, that's interesting. You can just switch. You can just say, I've had enough of this particularly hard problem right now, or this subject that's doing my head, and I'm going to flip and do something else.
That's right.
And that is a breather from the problem, but it's also productive.
That's exactly right. And if you look at the end of a session, if you did something productive, you can feel good about it. Because the bottom line for study is productivity equals motivation and happiness. Because if you're actually making progress, even though study's not that fun, you can still feel really good about what you've achieved. But if you're banging your head against a brick wall the whole time, you don't even get that satisfaction. So trying to avoid it as much as possible is a good thing.
Again, what's a good break? We know, I don't know if it's still 20 minutes, that we can handle of intense concentration. Exercise is fantastic if they go out and go for a run or go out for a walk or whatever, but they may rather go and play on this PlayStation. Does it matter? Do you just need to get regular breaks and then get back in there?
Well, here's the thing. The best thing is always doing something physical, like moving your body, because a physical kind of break means you're turning off your brain a little bit. That being said, it's much, much better to have a break than not a break. So any break is a good idea. And if you can do something, even just getting up and walking around the house or walking to the fridge is a good idea. But physically getting up and moving is the best. But just do something. Some break is better than no break.
Just finally, your own experience. I think part of why you got into this, did you struggle with exam study?
Yeah, well, I really thought school was stupid when I was going through it. I didn't like it at all. And I remember just sitting at home with this textbook and just thinking, I don't know what to do. I don't like this. I wish someone would just tell me what's in the exam and I could do it. And I went on to become a teacher, and you see all the students with the same thing. They're kind of lost. They're not that motivated. But if I sat down and was like, here's what you need to do for your exams, it's coming up in this maths exam next week, they were so motivated and they actually really took the time to try. So with LearnCoach, what we're doing now is just try to make simple videos initially, just to show students, here's what you need to know for your exams, here's how they'll ask you the questions, here's what you need to do for an answer. So very simple, just so when students are stuck by themselves, they have something just to help them work through all this information. Because it's pretty easy once you know, and feels impossible when you don't know. So that's the big focus of what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Dave. Dave Cameron, Chief Executive of the online learning tool LearnCoach. And good luck to everyone about to get into NCEA season. It has been a hell of a year, but still, exams are always what they are. And you just roll up your sleeves and get stuck in.